day and writer by night. She has spent the last 8 years writing a book about her days at Neskowin Valley School, a small private school in Oregon. Someday, it'll be finished. This is Darlene's third story. Let's welcome Darlene.
In 1993, I was an awkward 12-year-old growing up in a small town in Oregon. My father was a child abuse survivor, and as an adult, he turned his traumatic past into a crusade to end abuse. An impossible feat to accomplish for just one man. We were originally from San Francisco, and bringing his ideas for change into the small town didn't sit very well with certain members of the community. It scared a few and angered many, and some were compelled to make threatening phone calls to our home. Surprisingly, those angered included my teacher, principal, librarian, the nurse, the cook, and a few front office staff at my public middle school. So it took no time to figure out who my father was. When adults start treating you differently, kids pick up on that right away. When they learned they could bully me and not get in trouble, it quickly turned vicious. Some were bold enough to come at me in the middle of class, and when I cried out, the teacher would say to me, "I didn't see anything. I think you're imagining things, Darlene." As a budding writer, it devastated me when my librarian pulled me aside and said my father was wrong and that he was going to get what was coming to him. The thought of adults that I looked up to could actually hurt me sent me into a deep depression. I was 12 years old and I was suicidal. One morning, my father was reading the local newspaper and he saw a photograph of his main detractors at a bake sale. And he finally put a face to their names and recognized a few of them as my teachers. My mother said he threw the newspaper across the room and lost his mind. He jumped into the car, drove straight to school, he slammed through the front doors and demanded that I be taken out. Unfortunately, there weren't many alternatives, and my parents were ill-equipped to homeschool me. My mother had joined a New Age group, and in between meditation and drum circles, one of the members suggested a private school in the next county. Neskowin Valley School was a 45-minute drive away, over a mountain range, and down an unstable road through the dense Siuslaw National Forest. As I was being driven to this secluded place, I started to fantasize that I was being taken to the home of an eccentric private tutor. He'd be like some hermit living in a barn with abstract methods of teaching. Although at that point, anything would beat public school. I was horrified when we arrived at a building that was clearly once a dairy barn. Instead of cattle in the pasture, there was a playground and a soccer field. Instead of livestock, it was crawling with noisy children heading to their classes. And instead of bales of hay, there were bookshelves and finger paintings all along the wall. My class was upstairs in a tiny loft. Inside this room fit both the 7th and 8th grade, and that year they boasted that they had the largest attendance in history with 90 kids and a whopping 18 in my class, all crammed inside that little loft. I was terrified of being the new student, and now I had trust issues. So when I walked in, I was met with bright, smiling, teenaged faces. And a few even embraced me and told me how happy they were to join the class. Our first class was theater, and it was unlike any theater class I had seen. The teacher was so animated and encouraged the students to improvise. She called out to the class, "Now you're in space!" And all the kids started to slowly fall to the ground. One even reached her hand out to me in hopes that I would save her from being lost in space. The girl kept falling, and when I refused, slowly crawling out, "No!" all I could think of was, these kids are nuts. And I stood frozen as teenagers were writhing around at my feet. I was sure these kids were body snatchers. If I fell asleep, I'd be transformed into an overly happy, huggy teen like the rest of them. And I was cautious for months, but little did I know this place was healing me. And what I needed to do was smile, laugh, and hug it out a lot. And how did I repay them? One day we were tasked to collect various plant and soil samples for our science class. Now, our teacher gave us permission to collect these samples wherever we saw fit, just as long as we kept to the buddy system. And some went to a nearby river, and others stayed on the playground collecting samples. And my partner and I, we stepped off campus and into a neighboring farm. And the field was filled with grazing cattle, and we watched in awe. I had never seen cows up close before and realized how big they were. They're huge. We were approached by the farmer, and to this day, I have absolutely no idea why he did this. But he asked us if we could help him herd his cattle to the next plot over. He opened the gate to the road and motioned us to start herding. Now, we were good kids and smart. We knew we couldn't do this alone. So we went back and asked the teacher if we could do this, who thought that this would be fun for the whole class. But we were a group of hippie teenagers who had never herded cattle before. So we did what we thought was only natural. We ran with our hands up in the air, waving and screaming like wild banshees. In our minds, this would lead the cows to calmly walk to the gate, onto the road, and walk single file to the other field. Do you know what happens when you run screaming at a herd of cattle? They scatter. Many ran toward us at full speed, while others jumped into the river. When we saw these cows coming run toward us, our flight or flight response kicked in, and we turned around and we just started running as fast as we could back to school. And the cows were right behind us the entire time. Now here we were, running across the playground, screaming bloody murder, while being followed by a stampede back to school. Luckily, absolutely no one got hurt. Some climbed trees to the top, others to the top of the monkey bars, while others held on for dear life, crying on the merry-go-round. And afterward, the entire campus was swamped with grazing cattle, traumatized kids, and a very distraught farmer. I don't remember exactly how we got them all back to the farm, especially to the ones that had crossed into the river and made their way into the national forest. I'm sure I don't remember because I blamed myself for the whole thing and ran and hid in the bathroom. I thought I was going to get expelled for this, but it never happened. No one called my parents, and there was no detention. There was no such thing as detention at this school. In fact, my parents never heard this story until I confessed years later. In the end, I happily closed my eyes and let Neskowin transform me. And after 25 years later, I'm still close to these classmates, and we continue to hug it out when times get rough. And Neskowin helped me deal with the trauma that I faced at public school, and they pointed me in the right direction. And by the end of the year, I wanted to grow up to become a writer and a scientist, but more importantly, that I wanted to live. And today, I am both a writer and a scientist with only a minor irrational fear of cows.